Welcome back to another journey through the quieter corridors of history. Tonight, we're stepping into the shadowed world of those who raised kings and queens, the governesses, tutors, and nursemaids, who devoted their lives to children they could never truly call their own. Before we settle in together, if you enjoy what we do here, feel free to give this video a gentle like and subscribe to join our community of night wanderers. And I'd love to know in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? There's something wonderfully connecting about knowing we're all gathered here from different corners of the world, sharing these quiet hours with the past. Now, dim the lights, find your most comfortable position, and let yourself drift back with me to a time when love and duty intertwined in the most complicated ways imaginable. Imagine, if you will, the peculiar loneliness of loving a child who will never be yours, of teaching letters to tiny fingers that will one day sign death warrants, of kissing scraped knees that will eventually bear the weight of crowns. This was the world of the royal governess, a woman caught between servant and surrogate mother, privy to the most intimate moments of future monarchs, yet forever an outsider to the very family she helped create. Tonight, we'll walk through gilded nurseries, where lullabies carried the weight of dynasty, where arithmetic lessons masked deeper teachings about power and survival, and where the women who gave their hearts to royal children often found themselves discarded when their charges came of age. These are stories of devotion rewarded with exile, of secrets that killed, and of love that transcended the rigid boundaries of class and protocol. So close your eyes, let your breathing slow, and join me as we explore the forgotten sacrifices of those who shaped the rulers of Europe, one gentle lesson at a time. Verse 1. A governess's journal teaching a doomed prince arithmetic. The morning light filters through the tall windows of the Dauphin's apartments at Versailles, casting long rectangles of pale gold across the polished parquet floors. It is October 15th, 1785, and Madame Elizabeth Brunette sits at the small mahogany table, her worn leather journal open before her as she prepares for another day in the carefully orchestrated life of the future King of France. She dips her quill in the silver inkwell, a gift from the Queen herself, and begins to write in her neat, slanted hand. Today marks the 137th day of our arithmetic studies. His Royal Highness Louis Joseph continues to struggle with division, though not, I suspect, from any lack of intelligence. The boy in question, Louis Joseph Xavier Francois, Dauphin of France, first son of Louis XVI, and Marie Antoinette, sits nearby in a miniature chair upholstered in blue silk, his small legs swinging freely beneath the seat. At 7 years old, he possesses the serious dark eyes of his father and the delicate features that mark him unmistakably as a child of Versailles. This morning, like every morning, his stockings are perfectly white, his coat immaculately pressed, his small powdered wig arranged with mathematical precision by hands that will never know a day of honest labor. Madame Brunette closes her journal and turns to her charge with the practiced smile. She has perfected over 15 years of royal service. Good morning, Your Royal Highness. Shall we begin with yesterday's lesson? The ritual unfolds as it has for months. She places the wooden counting blocks on the table, not common wood, mind you, but polished cherry carved by the finest craftsmen in Paris, each block bearing a single number painted in gold leaf. The extravagance of even the simplest teaching tools at Versailles never ceases to amaze her, though she has learned to accept such luxuries as natural as breathing. If the royal treasury contains 60 livres, she begins, her voice soft and measured, and we must distribute them equally among 12 provinces, how many livres would each province receive? Louis Joseph picks up one of the blocks, turning it over in his small, pale hands. His fingernails are perfectly clean, manicured daily by a servant whose sole responsibility is the grooming of the royal children. He has never known the satisfaction of dirt under his nails, never felt the rough bark of a tree or the honest soil of France beneath his feet. Must we always speak of money and provinces, madame? He asks, his voice carrying that peculiar mixture of childish petulance and premature formality that marks all royal children. Can we not count birds, or horses, or dot or flowers? Madame Brunette pauses, her pen hovering over the paper where she records each lesson's progress. In her journal that evening, she will write, "The Dauphin displays a concerning tendency toward frivolity. When presented with practical mathematics of governance, he yearns instead for pastoral subjects inappropriate to his station. I fear the influence of his mother's sensibilities. But in this moment, looking at the 7-year-old boy, who will likely never see his 20th birthday though, neither he nor she knows this, she feels a flutter of something dangerously close to maternal indulgence. Very well, she says quietly, gathering up the wooden blocks. Let us say that in the gardens of Versailles, there are 60 roses blooming, and the head gardener wishes to create 12 equal bouquets for the chateau's dining rooms, ... The boy's face brightens immediately, and for a moment, the careful mask of royal deportment slips away, revealing the child beneath. He leans forward eagerly, his small hands reaching for the blocks with genuine enthusiasm. This is the Louis Joseph that Madame Brunette treasures, not the future king, but simply a boy who delights in flowers and stories. As they work through the problem together, the sounds of Versailles drift through the windows. The distant clip-clop of horses on cobblestones, the murmur of courtiers in the galleries below, the persistent fountain that has played the same melody for nearly a century. The palace breathes around them, a living thing sustained by ceremony and protocol, indifferent to the small human dramas unfolding within its walls. 5 roses in each bouquet, Louis Joseph announces proudly, having arranged the blocks into neat groups of 5. Excellent, Your Royal Highness. Madame Brunette makes a note in her lesson book, her handwriting more relaxed now. And if the gardener decided to make only 10 bouquets instead? The boy's brow furrows in concentration. These moments of pure learning, uncomplicated by the weight of dynasty and expectation, are the ones Madame Brunette will remember most clearly in the dark years to come. She watches his small fingers work through the problem, noting how he chews his lower lip, a habit she has tried unsuccessfully to correct, though she secretly finds it endearing. The morning passes in this gentle rhythm of question and discovery. They progress from simple division to more complex problems, always framed in terms that capture the boy's imagination. By the time the ornate clock in the corner chimes 10 o'clock, they have distributed imaginary sheep among imaginary shepherds, divided mythical treasures among fairy tale kingdoms, and calculated the provisions needed for impossible journeys to impossible lands. But as the lesson draws to a close, reality intrudes with a soft knock that signals the arrival of Monsieur de Coigny, the boy's dancing master. The transformation is immediate and heartbreaking to witness. Louis Joseph's shoulders straighten, his expression becomes carefully neutral, and the child disappears once again behind the mask of future kingship. We shall continue tomorrow, Your Royal Highness, Madame Brunette says, beginning to pack away the counting blocks. Yes, Madame, he replies formally, though his eyes linger on the blocks with something that might be longing. As the dancing master enters a thin, precise man whose every movement is calculated to demonstrate perfect court etiquette, Madame Brunette gathers her materials and prepares to withdraw. This too is part of the ritual. She must fade into the background, become invisible, allow the next phase of the prince's education to commence without her presence, complicating the careful choreography of royal instruction. But today, as she reaches the door, Louis Joseph's voice stops her. Madame Brunette? Yes, Your Royal Highness? Tomorrow, might we count the stars? I have been watching them from my window, and I think there might be exactly enough to divide equally among all the children in France. The dancing master clears his throat disapprovingly. Such flights of fancy are not appropriate for a future king, but Madame Brunette meets the boy's eyes and nods solemnly. We shall see what mathematics the stars might teach us, Your Royal Highness. That evening, in the small apartment assigned to her in the servants' quarters, Madame Brunette opens her journal once more. The room is sparse but comfortable. A narrow bed with clean linens, a wooden desk beneath a single window, a small fireplace that provides adequate warmth during the harsh Versailles winters. On the mantelpiece sits her only personal treasure, a miniature portrait of her own son, lost to fever 15 years ago, whose death led her to seek solace in caring for other people's children. She writes by candlelight, her hand steady despite the day's fatigue. October 15th, 1785. The Dauphin shows promise in arithmetic when the problems are presented imaginatively. His mind is quick, though his attention wanders toward subjects his position forbids him to pursue openly. Today, he asked to count stars and distribute them among the children of France. I was struck by the profound loneliness in his request. A boy who has everything yet yearns for connection with those he will rule, but never truly know. She pauses, her quill hovering over the page. Should she write what she really thinks? That this sensitive, imaginative child seems ill-suited for the brutal realities of kinship. That his mother's influence has filled him with romantic notions that will serve him poorly in the years to come? That she sometimes catches him staring out the windows with an expression of such profound sadness that her heart breaks for him? Instead, she writes, I pray that his education will prepare him adequately for the challenges that await him. But even as she forms the words, she knows they are insufficient. No education could prepare anyone for what lies ahead. The revolution that will sweep away everything he has known, the mob that will bay for his family's blood, the brief, brutal reign that will end with his death at age 10, alone and abandoned in a prison cell, calling for the governess who loved him. The candle flickers, casting dancing shadows on the wall. Outside her window, the palace sleeps fitfully, its dreams troubled by debts it cannot pay and promises it cannot keep. In the royal apartments, Louis Joseph sleeps in his silk-curtained bed, watched over by guards who protect a throne that may not exist by the time he comes of age to claim it. And in her simple room, Madame Brunette closes her journal and prepares for bed, unaware that she is recording the final golden days of a world that will soon cease to exist entirely. Tomorrow, she will teach the prince to count stars. But tonight, she counts her blessings. Another day spent in service to a child who needs her. Another evening of quiet purpose in a world growing increasingly uncertain. She does not know that in 4 years' time, she will flee Versailles in the dark of night, her journal hidden beneath her traveling dress, carrying with her the memory of a boy who dreamed of dividing stars among the children of France. The mathematics of love she reflects as sleep takes her cannot be calculated with counting box or reduced to neat equations. It exists in the spaces between numbers, in the pause before a child's smile, in the gentle correction of a small hand learning to form the letters of his name. These are the calculations that matter, though they appear in no royal ledger and serve no grand political purpose. In the morning, she will rise before dawn to prepare another day's lessons, choosing problems that will engage the prince's imagination while teaching him the practical skills he will need as king. She will count out the wooden blocks, sharpen her quills, and arrange the small desk where a boy learns to see his kingdom in terms of division and multiplication, addition and subtraction. But for now, she sleeps peacefully, dreaming of roses arranged in perfect mathematical harmony, of stars distributed with divine precision, of a world where love and duty dance together in flawless balance, and where the children in her care never grow old enough to break her heart. Verse 2. Madame de Maintenon's regret, the secret wife who raised Louis XIV's bastards. The fire in the private study crackles softly, its orange glow dancing across the weathered face of a woman who has lived through more transformations than most people experience in several lifetimes. It is December 1718, and Françoise d'Aubigny, Marquise de Maintenon, sits in her modest chair at the convent of Saint-Cyr, the school she founded for impoverished noble girls. The Sun King has been dead for 3 years now, and with him has died the world that made her one of the most powerful women in France. At 83, her hands are spotted with age, her once golden hair now silver beneath her simple white cap. The elaborate gowns and jewels of Versailles have given way to the practical dark wool of a woman who has chosen devotion over decoration. Yet her eyes remain sharp and intelligent, carrying within them the weight of secrets that will die with her. She lifts her quill and begins to write, not in the careful court French that served her so well for 40 years, but in the more intimate language of memory and regret. I have been thinking much of late about the children, not the king's legitimate offspring, who were raised by others in the full light of royal ceremony, but the ones who came to me in shadow and secrecy, the ones whose very existence was a scandal to be managed, a problem to be solved with discretion and care. The children she speaks of were born of love, if such a word can be applied to the calculated passions of kings. Louis XIV's affair with Madame de Montespan had been the talk of Europe in the 1670s, a liaison so flagrant, so openly conducted, that it shocked even the jaded courtiers of Versailles. And from this union came the children: Louis Auguste, Louise Françoise, Louise Isée, Louise Marie, Françoise Marie, Louis Alexander, and Louis Charles. 7 bastards of the Sun King, each one a living reminder of their father's human appetites. It was Madame de Maintenon, then still the widowed Madame Scarron, who was chosen to raise them in secret, not because she possessed any particular qualifications for such a role, but because she was discreet, intelligent, and desperately in need of the generous pension such service would provide. She had been born Françoise d'Albini, the granddaughter of the Protestant poet Agrippa the Bini, raised in poverty so profound that she had once shared a single pair of shoes with her siblings. I remember the first time they brought Louis Auguste to me, she writes, her pen moving slowly across the paper. He was perhaps 3 years old, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's imperious chin. He did not cry when his wet nurse left him. He had already learned, as all royal children must, that attachment is a luxury they cannot afford. The house where she established her secret nursery was in the Rue de Vaugirard, far from the gossip and intrigue of the court. It was a modest establishment by royal standards, though luxurious enough to satisfy the needs of the king's children. Here, in rooms decorated with tapestries, but not gilt, furnished with comfort, but not ostentation, the bastard children of Louis XIV learned to walk, to speak, to read, and to understand their peculiar position in the world. Madame de Maintenon proved to be a natural mother, though she had never borne children of her own. She possessed that rare combination of warmth and discipline that children require, the ability to love deeply while maintaining the emotional distance necessary for effective governance. Each child received individual attention, carefully tailored lessons, and most importantly, the consistent presence of an adult who cared for their well-being without regard for political advantage. Louise Françoise was the most challenging, her memoir continues. Even as a small child, she possessed a will of iron and a temper that could empty a room. She would stand in the nursery, her tiny fists clenched, and demand to know why she could not live at Versailles like other children of noble birth. How does one explain legitimacy to a 5-year-old? How does one make a child understand that the circumstances of her birth, through no fault of her own, mark her as different, as less, as forever on the margins of the world she should have inherited? The daily routine of the secret household followed a pattern that Madame de Maintenon established with meticulous care. The children rose at 7, attended morning prayers. She had converted to Catholicism partly for their sake, knowing that Protestant governors would not be tolerated, broke their fast with bread and chocolate, and then began their lessons. The boys studied Latin, mathematics, history, and military strategy. The girls learned French, Italian, music, dancing, and the complex art of courtly deportment. But alongside these formal studies, There were quieter lessons, the kind that could only be taught through example and patient repetition. How to bear disappointment with grace. How to find joy in small pleasures. How to love others without losing oneself. How to navigate a world that would always see them as interesting anomalies, rather than full participants in the grand drama of royal life. The king visited rarely in those early years, Madame de Maintenon recalls. When he did come, the transformation was remarkable. These children, who laughed and quarreled and played like any others, would suddenly become small courtiers, bowing and curtsying with perfect precision, addressing their father with the formal deference due to majesty. He would inspect them as a general might inspect troops kind enough, but distant, measuring their progress against some internal standard known only to himself. It was during one of these visits, in 1675, that the king's attention shifted from the children to their governess. Madame de Montespan, grown jealous and increasingly difficult, had begun to lose her hold on the royal affections. Louis XIV found himself drawn to the quiet intelligence of the woman who had so successfully managed the delicate situation of his bastard offspring. The transformation from governess to royal favorite occurred gradually, almost imperceptibly. At first, the king simply lingered longer during his visits, asking not only about the children's progress, but about Madame de Maintenon's opinions on education, on literature, on the complex questions of statecraft. She possessed something that the glittering beauties of his court lacked, the ability to engage his mind as well as his senses. I did not seek to supplant Madame de Montespan, she writes, though the claim rings somewhat hollow even to her own ears. I sought only to serve the children entrusted to my care. But the king was lonely, I think, beneath all his magnificence. He had spent so many years being worshipped and feared that he had forgotten what it felt like to be simply heard, simply understood. By 1680, the secret was an open one at court. Madame de Montespan had been dismissed, pensioned off with a ducal title in a chateau far from Versailles. The bastard children had been legitimized and brought to court, where they took their places in the royal household with all the ceremony their birth had initially denied them. And Madame de Maintenon had been elevated to the unprecedented position of the king's morganatic wife married to him in secret, unable to share his throne, but undeniably his partner in all but name. The irony was not lost on me, she reflects. I had gained everything I had never dared to dream of: wealth, position, the ear of the most powerful man in Europe. Yet in winning these prizes, I lost the thing I had come to value most: my daily intimacy with the children who had become, in every way that mattered, my own. At court, the dynamics inevitably shifted. The children she had raised now moved in circles where she could not follow, their lives governed by protocols that placed her firmly in the role of stepmother, rather than the nurturing presence she had been in their early years. Louis Auguste, now the Duc du Maine, became a fixture in his father's military campaigns. Louise Francoise married into the House of Conde, becoming the Duchesse de Bourbon. One by one, they took their places in the grand machinery of royal succession and alliance. Yet the bonds forged in those early years at the Rue de Vaugirard proved lasting. Throughout her decades as the king's wife, Madame de Maintenon continued to serve as confidant and advisor to the children she had raised. They came to her with their marital troubles, their financial difficulties, their struggles with the impossible expectations that royal birth imposed upon them. She had taught them arithmetic and Latin, but more importantly, she had taught them that they were worthy of love despite the circumstances of their birth. Louis Alexander troubled me most as he grew older, she writes, her hand growing heavier with fatigue. He possessed his father's intelligence, but none of his discipline. The boy who had once recited poetry so beautifully became a man who found solace in wine and gambling. I wondered often if I had failed him somehow, if there was some lesson I should have taught him that might have prepared him better for the peculiar burden of being both royal and illegitimate. The question of failure haunts the final pages of her memoir. Had she done right by these children? Had her love for them been sufficient compensation for the complex circumstances of their birth? Had she prepared them adequately for lives that would always be lived in the shadow of legitimacy? I gave them what I could, she concludes. Stability in their early years, education appropriate to their station, and most importantly, the knowledge that they were valued, not for their usefulness to their father's plans, but for themselves alone. Whether that was enough ... That is a question I cannot answer. The fire has burned low during her hours of writing, and the candles have shortened to stubs. Outside the convent walls, the world continues its relentless transformation. The old order that made kings of men and bastards of children is beginning to crack, though the full revolution is still decades away. New ideas about equality and natural rights are taking hold in salons and coffeehouses, challenging the very foundations upon which her life has been built. She sets down her quill and closes the manuscript, knowing that these words will never be published, never be read by any eyes but her own. They are written not for posterity, but for closure, a final accounting of a life spent in service to other people's children, other people's dreams, other people's versions of love. Tomorrow she will rise early, as she has every day for decades, contend to her students at St. Cyr. These girls, orphaned daughters of impoverished nobility, represent perhaps her truest legacy. Unlike the royal bastards she raised, these children come to her with no claims to greatness, no expectations of glory. They seek only education, preparation for modest lives as wives and mothers, and perhaps teachers themselves. In teaching them, she has found a peace that eluded her during her years at Versailles. There is something pure about educating children who will never rule kingdoms or command armies, who will measure their success not in territories conquered, but in families raised, not in courtiers impressed, but in small kindnesses offered to neighbors and strangers alike. As she prepares for bed, Madame de Maintenon reflects on the strange mathematics of a life spent raising other people's children. The love she gave cannot be quantified. The influence she wielded cannot be measured in conventional terms. She shaped the character of princes and dukes, but perhaps more importantly, she demonstrated that even the most irregular family arrangements could provide genuine nurture and care. The bastard children of Louis XIV grew up to be adults of varying degrees of happiness and success, but all of them carried within them the lessons she had taught. That worth was not determined by birth alone, that love could transcend social convention, and that the truest nobility lay not in titles inherited, but in duties faithfully performed. In the darkness of her simple cell, she whispers a prayer for each of them: Louis Auguste with his literary ambitions, Louise Françoise with her fierce independence, all the others scattered now across the noble houses of France. They are her children still, bound to her not by blood, but by the deeper ties of shared experience, mutual affection, and the memory of a time when they were simply children in need of care, before the world claimed them for its own purposes. The convent sleeps around her, filled with the dreams of young women who will never know the intoxicating dangers of royal favor, who will never face the impossible choice between love and duty that defined her own life. Perhaps they are fortunate in their limitations, she thinks. Perhaps the greatest gift she can give them is the knowledge that a life of service, however humble, can be its own form of nobility. And perhaps, in the end, that is lesson enough. Verse 3. The poisoned nursemaid of Prussia, a servant killed for knowing an heir's true parentage. The records are incomplete, as they often are when secrets die with their keepers. But in the Prussian state archives, filed beneath layers of diplomatic correspondence and military dispatches, lies a single sheet of parchment that tells a story darker than most fairy tales. The document, dated March 15, 1688, is written in the precise hand of a court physician named Dr. Johann Albrecht von Zimmern, and it begins with these chilling words. By order of His Majesty Friedrich Wilhelm, Elector of Brandenburg. I have this day examined the body of one Anna Katharina Muller, aged 34 years, lately employed as nursemaid to His Royal Highness Prince Friedrich. Death occurred at approximately 3 o'clock in the morning of March 14th, following a brief illness characterized by violent convulsions, excessive salivation, and the distinctive sweet odor of bitter almonds upon the breath. Dr. von Zimmern was careful to use the clinical language of his profession, but even 3 centuries later, the subtext is unmistakable. Anna Katharina Muller had been poisoned, almost certainly with bitter almond extract, a method favored by those who wished to disguise murder as natural death. What the good doctor does not record, what he perhaps dared not commit to paper, is why a simple nursemaid would warrant such an elaborate and dangerous elimination. To understand Anna's fate, we must travel back 2 years, to the winter of 1686, when she first arrived at the Berliner Schloss to take up her position in the royal nursery. She came with impeccable credentials, the daughter of a respected Lutheran minister from Königsberg, educated in French and Latin, experienced in the care of noble children. More importantly, she possessed the discretion and unquestioning loyalty that royal service demanded. The Prussia of Friedrich Wilhelm was a nation still defining itself, caught between the declining power of Poland to the east and the rising influence of France to the west. The Elector himself was a man of contradictions, pious yet pragmatic, devoted to his Dutch wife Dorothea, yet capable of the calculated marriages and alliances that political necessity required. His court was smaller and less opulent than Versailles, but no less complex in its web of competing interests and hidden agendas. Anna's primary charge was Prince Friedrich, the heir to the electoral throne, born in 1688 to great celebration throughout the Protestant territories. The boy was healthy, intelligent, and bore the distinctive Hohenzollern features that marked him unmistakably as his father's son. Or so it appeared to the casual observer. But Anna Katharina Muller was not a casual observer. As nursemaid, she was privy to the most intimate moments of royal family life. She knew when the electress took to her bed with mysterious ailments, when private physicians made unscheduled visits to the royal apartments, when urgent messages arrived from correspondents whose names were never spoken aloud. Most crucially, she was present during those quiet hours when adults assume that servants, like furniture, neither see, nor hear, nor remember. The first indication that something was amiss came during Anna's 3rd month of service. She had been tending to Prince Friedrich during one of his afternoon naps when an unexpected visitor arrived. Graf Heinrich von Dönhoff, a Baltic nobleman whose estates bordered those of the Swedish crown. The meeting between Dönhoff and the electress was conducted in hushed tones, but Anna, attending to her duties in the adjacent nursery, could not help but overhear fragments of their conversation. ... to not continue much longer, came the electress's voice, strained with what sounded like exhaustion or despair. Double quotes ... the boy grows more like him each day ... Patience, Your Highness, Dönhoff replied in his heavily accented German. These matters resolve themselves in time. The blood will tell one way or another. And if it tells the wrong story, then we must ensure the right story is the only one that survives. Anna had continued her work, folding tiny linens and arranging the prince's clothes for the evening, but her mind raced with possibilities. The conversation made little sense taken at face value, yet something in the tone, the careful euphemisms, the pregnant silences, suggested depths she was perhaps not meant to fathom. Over the following months, she began to notice other peculiarities. Letters arrived for the electress bearing Swedish seals, always delivered by the same discreet messenger who came and went without announcement. The prince himself, as he grew from infant to toddler, began to display characteristics that seemed oddly at variance with his supposed Hohenzollern heritage. His hair, initially dark like his father's, gradually lightened to an auburn shade that matched no one in the electoral family. His eyes, originally the deep brown of the Brandenburg line, developed flecks of green that grew more pronounced with each passing month. Most tellingly, the boy's temperament differed markedly from the serious, methodical personality that characterized his supposed father. Prince Friedrich was gregarious, impulsive, quick to laughter, and equally quick to tears, traits that seemed to mirror those of Graf von Dönhoff, who had become an increasingly frequent visitor to the royal apartments. Anna kept her observations to herself, as was proper for a servant of her station, but she began to maintain a private journal, recording not gossip or speculation, but simple facts, dates of visits, overheard conversations, physical changes in her charge. She told herself it was merely the natural curiosity of an educated woman, a way of organizing her thoughts and impressions. In truth, she was building a case, though she could not yet articulate what crime she suspected. The revelation came on a November evening in 1687, during one of the Electress's frequent indispositions. Anna had been summoned to bring the prince to his mother's chamber for his nightly blessing, touching ritual that reinforced the bonds of family while providing opportunities for political theater. But as she approached the royal apartments, she heard voices engaged in heated discussion. ... cannot deny what is obvious to anyone with eyes ... This was Dr. von Zimmern, the court physician, his usually measured tones sharp with frustration. The resemblance could be coincidental, replied the Electress, though without conviction. Madam, I have served this house for 20 years. I know the Hohenzollern bloodline as well as any man living. The child bears not one feature of his supposed father, while displaying every characteristic of... He paused, as if the words themselves were dangerous. Say it, the Electress commanded, of Graf von Dönhoff. The boy is not the Elector's son. The silence that followed was so complete that Anna could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. She stood frozen in the corridor, Prince Friedrich sleeping peacefully in her arms, while the foundations of European politics shifted quietly in the room beyond. What would you have me do? The Electress finally whispered. Confess to adultery? Destroy my marriage, my son's inheritance, the alliance between Brandenburg and the Dutch Republic? For what? To satisfy your physician's need for biological accuracy? I would have you consider the consequences if this truth emerges through other means. Dr. von Zimmern replied. Secrets of this magnitude rarely remain hidden forever, and when they surface, as they inevitably do, the damage is infinitely worse than honesty would have caused. Then we must ensure this particular secret goes to the grave with all who know it. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Anna understood immediately that she was no longer merely a witness to royal indiscretion, but a liability to be managed. Her knowledge of the prince's true parentage made her dangerous to people who commanded armies and treasuries, who could make inconvenient problems disappear with a word or a gesture. She began to make her own preparations. Quietly, she copied the most significant entries from her journal onto separate sheets of parchment, which she sewed into the lining of her traveling cloak. She wrote letters to her family in Königsberg, carefully worded to convey affection without revealing her growing fear. Most importantly, she began to vary her routines, taking different routes through the castle, eating at irregular times, never sleeping in the same location 2 nights in succession. For months, her precautions seemed unnecessary. The Electress treated her with the same distant courtesy she had always shown. Dr. von Zimmern nodded politely when they passed in the corridors, and Graf von Dönhoff continued his visits without acknowledging her presence. Anna began to hope that perhaps she had misunderstood the threat implicit in that overheard conversation. But on the night of March 13, 1688, her caution proved insufficient. She had retired to her small chamber in the servants' quarters after an ordinary day of tending to Prince Friedrich. The boy had been fretful, teething perhaps, and she was exhausted from the effort of keeping him entertained and comfortable. She prepared for bed with her usual rituals, brushing her long brown hair, saying her evening prayers, checking that her door was securely bolted. The wine was waiting on her bedside table when she emerged from her prayers. This was unusual. Servants were not typically provided with wine in their private chambers, but not so extraordinary as to arouse immediate suspicion. Anna assumed it was a gift from the electress, perhaps an acknowledgement of her patient service during the prince's difficult day. The first sip tasted normal, perhaps slightly more bitter than she expected, but not unpleasantly so. The second sip, a slight tingling sensation to her tongue, which she attributed to the unfamiliar vintage. By the third sip, she knew with terrible certainty that she had been betrayed. The bitter almond paste flooded her mouth as the poison began its work. Her vision blurred, her hands began to shake uncontrollably, and she felt her throat closing as if an invisible hand were squeezing the life from her. She managed to reach for the bell cord that would summon help, but her fingers were too weak to pull it effectively. In her final moments, as consciousness faded and her body convulsed with the poison's effects, Anna Katerina Muller understood that she was dying not for what she had done, but for what she knew. Her crime was knowledge, her sentence was silence, and her execution was taking place in the darkness of a servant's chamber by the royal family. She had slept peacefully in their gilded beds. Dr. von Zimmern's examination the following morning was thorough, but predetermined. He noted the symptoms, recorded the probable cause of death, and filed his report with the appropriate authorities. No investigation was ordered, no questions were asked, no justice was sought for a woman whose only sin was paying too much attention to the children in her care. The secret she died to protect remained safe for exactly 43 years. In 1731, when Graf von Dönhoff lay on his own deathbed, he confessed to his personal chaplain that he had fathered a son who would one day rule Prussia. The chaplain, bound by religious vows, kept this revelation to himself until his own death in 1759. By then, the child Anna had tended Prince Friedrich, later King Friedrich Wilhelm I, had been dead for 18 years, and the truth of his parentage had become merely a footnote to history. But perhaps the most tragic irony of Anna Katerina Muller's death was that her sacrifice was ultimately unnecessary. The boy she died protecting, whether Hohenzollern by blood or not, grew up to become exactly the kind of ruler Brandenburg needed: competent, dedicated, and utterly committed to the welfare of his subjects. His parentage, had it been revealed, would have caused political embarrassment, but not dynastic disaster. The bloodline that mattered was not the one that flowed through his veins, but the one he created through his actions and decisions as king. Anna's journal, sewn into her traveling cloak, was discovered by the maid who prepared her body for burial. Unable to read the Latin and French passages, the woman sold it to a merchant dealing in used books and papers. For decades, it passed from hand to hand, valued only for the quality of its paper and the careful penmanship, until it eventually found its way into a university library, where a graduate student in 1847 first recognized its historical significance. By then, the Prussia that Anna had known was itself becoming a memory, absorbed into the larger German state that would dominate European politics for the next century. The royal nursery where she had tended to Prince Friedrich had been converted to other uses. The servants' quarters where she died had been demolished and rebuilt, and the very names of the people who ordered her death had been largely forgotten by all but the most dedicated historians. Yet in those carefully preserved pages, written in a woman's neat hand by candlelight in the stolen moments between her duties, Anna Katerina Muller lives on. Her observations, recorded without malice or ambition, provide a window into the human cost of political necessity, the price paid by those who serve power without wielding it, and the eternal tension between loyalty and truth that defines the lives of all who care for other people's children. She was buried in the servants' section of the Berliner Dom Cemetery, her grave marked with a simple stone bearing only her name and dates. No mention was made of her service to the royal house, no acknowledgement given of her devotion to the prince she had raised. In death, as in life, she remained invisible to history, her story known only to those who cared enough to look beyond the official records and ask uncomfortable questions about the gaps and silences that mark every historical narrative. But on quiet nights, when the wind moves through the bare branches of the cemetery trees, visitors sometimes report hearing the sound of a woman's voice, soft and patient, singing the lullabies that once soothed a future king to sleep. Whether this is memory, imagination, or something more mysterious is impossible to say. What is certain is that Anna Katarina Muller's love for the child in her care transcended death itself, creating a bond that neither poison, nor time, nor political necessity could ultimately sever. The mathematics of her sacrifice cannot be calculated in conventional terms. She gave her life not for glory or gold, but for the protection of a secret that harmed no one and benefited few. Her reward was a grave in consecrated ground and the knowledge that her final act served the greater good, even if that good was built upon foundations of deception and maintained through violence. In the end, perhaps that is what we remember most about the women who raised royal children, not their success or failure in shaping future monarchs, but their willingness to love completely, even when that love demanded the ultimate price. Anna Katarina Muller died as she had lived in service to others, asking nothing for herself, content to remain in the shadows while others claimed the light. Her story reminds us that history is written not only by victors and rulers, but by the anonymous servants who tend their children, guard their secrets, and sometimes pay with their lives for the privilege of loving those they can never claim as their own. Verse 4. The prince who hated his governess, a royal diary railing against his jailer. The leather-bound journal sits behind glass in the British Museum, its pages yellowed with age, but its words still sharp with the indignant fury of adolescence. Written in the careful copperplate script taught to all gentlemen of the 18th century, it bears the bookplate of His Royal Highness Prince Edward Augustus, Duke of York and Albany, second son of King George III. The entries span nearly 3 years, from 1773 to 1776, documenting the stormy relationship between a teenage prince and the woman tasked with completing his education. The journal's opening entry, dated September 15th, 1773, sets the tone for everything that follows. Father has inflicted upon me a new torment in the form of Mrs. Margaret Planta, late of Switzerland, who arrived today with sufficient luggage to outfit a small army and an expression of such grim determination that I fear she means to reform not merely my education, but my very soul. She is perhaps 40 years of age, possessed of steel-gray hair drawn back so severely that it appears to stretch the skin of her face into a permanent mask of disapproval. When Father presented her to me, she curtsied with mathematical precision and informed me that she looked forward to elevating my mind to match my station. I informed her that my mind was quite elevated enough, thank you, and that I had no intention of submitting to elevation by a Swiss governess with pretensions above her birth. Prince Edward was 15 when Mrs. Planta entered his life, old enough to resent what he saw as an assault on his dignity, yet young enough to lack the emotional maturity necessary to understand the complexities of his position. As the second son of a king, whose mental health was already showing troubling signs of instability, Edward occupied a peculiar place in the royal hierarchy, important enough to require careful education, yet secondary enough to be subject to experiments in pedagogy that would never be attempted with the heir to the throne. Mrs. Margaret Planta was indeed Swiss, the daughter of a Protestant minister who had fled religious persecution in the Catholic cantons and settled in London, where she had established herself as one of the most sought-after educators in England. She possessed a formidable intellect, fluency in 6 languages, and most dangerously from Prince Edward's perspective, an absolute conviction that birth conferred obligation rather than privilege. She has begun each day, Edward writes in his second entry, by informing me of my duties as a prince of the blood. Not my rights, mind you, but my duties. She speaks of duty as other people speak of breathing, as something so fundamental to existence that its absence would mean death. This morning she presented me with a schedule of studies that would challenge a university scholar. Latin and Greek before breakfast, French and German until noon, mathematics and natural philosophy through the afternoon, with history and moral philosophy reserved for the evening hours. When I protested that such a regimen would leave no time for the pursuits proper to a gentleman, hunting, riding, the society of my equals, she replied that a prince has no equals save God and his own conscience, and that both deserve better than the idle pleasures I have thus far preferred. The battle lines were drawn from the first week. Prince Edward, accustomed to the deferential treatment accorded his rank, found himself facing a woman who acknowledged his title with perfect courtesy, while utterly ignoring its supposed advantages. When he declared that princes did not submit to examinations, she replied that princes who could not demonstrate their learning were no better than decorated fools. When he insisted that his birth exempted him from the tedious memorization of facts, she countered that birth without education was merely expensive ignorance. Today, she committed the ultimate impertinence, reads an entry from October 1773. When I failed to complete the Latin translation, she had assigned Tacitus, if you please, as if the tedious moral reflections of ancient Romans had any bearing on the modern world. She informed me that I would remain in the schoolroom until the work was finished, regardless of my other obligations. I reminded her that I was expected at Lord Sandwich's hunting party, that my absence would be noted and remarked upon by persons of consequence. Her reply will forever remain burned into my memory. Your Royal Highness, the only person of consequence in this room, is the one who will one day answer to God and history for how he has used the privileges of his birth. That person is not I. The sheer audacity of it, to suggest that I am accountable to anyone save my father, the king. Yet as the months passed, a curious transformation began to occur in the prince's diary entries. The initial fury gave way to grudging respect, then to something approaching genuine intellectual engagement. Mrs. Planta's teaching methods, while rigorous, were never merely punitive. She possessed the rare ability to make learning feel like discovery rather than drudgery, to connect the abstract principles of philosophy and mathematics to the concrete challenges of governance and leadership. I confess, Edward writes in December 1773 that her lessons in political economy have proven unexpectedly illuminating. She required me to calculate the cost of maintaining a regiment of guards for 1 year, including not merely their wages, but their provisions, equipment, housing, and the pensions owed to their widows and orphans. The sum was staggering far more than I would have imagined. When I expressed surprise, she observed that a prince who does not understand the true cost of his decisions is destined to make expensive mistakes. Every sovereign, she said, must be part accountant, part philosopher, and part father to his people. The first keeps him honest, the second keeps him wise, and the third keeps him humble. I am beginning to suspect that her lessons contain deeper purposes than I initially perceived. The relationship between student and teacher became increasingly complex as Prince Edward matured. Mrs. Planta never relaxed her standards or softened her criticisms, but she began to reveal glimpses of genuine affection for her difficult charge. When he mastered a particularly challenging mathematical proof, she would nod with satisfaction and murmur, "Well done, Your Royal Highness." When he composed an essay that demonstrated real understanding of historical patterns, she would ask probing questions that pushed him to develop his ideas further. More significantly, she began to share stories of her own experiences, carefully chosen to illustrate broader principles. She told him of her father's flight from religious persecution, connecting it to lessons about tolerance and the dangers of absolute power. She described her years as a governess to the children of merchants and manufacturers, using these experiences to illuminate the changing nature of English society and the growing importance of trade and industry. Mrs. Planta recounted today. Edward writes in March 1774, The story of a merchant's son, she once taught, a boy of quick intelligence but limited prospects due to his father's modest circumstances. She trained him in languages and mathematics, helped him secure a position with a trading company, and watched him rise through talent and industry to become one of London's most successful importers. Birth, Your Royal Highness, she observed, may determine where one begins the race, but it is character that determines where one finishes. I found myself wondering if she meant this as encouragement or warning. The most dramatic test of their relationship came in the summer of 1774, when Prince Edward fell seriously ill with a fever that kept him bedridden for nearly a month. Mrs. Planta nursed him with a devotion that surprised both of them, sitting by his bedside through the worst nights, reading to him when he was too weak to focus on his studies, and gradually guiding him back to health with a patience that revealed the maternal heart beneath her stern exterior. During my illness, he writes, I saw a side of Mrs. Plana that she keeps carefully hidden during our ordinary intercourse. When the fever was highest, and I was, according to the physicians, in some danger, she remained at my bedside throughout the night, bathing my forehead with cool cloths and speaking to me in German, her native tongue, I believe, though she has never acknowledged this in our formal lessons. In my delirium, I imagined that she was my mother, and I called out to her as Mama, a liberty that would have mortified me in health. She did not correct me or remind me of the proper forms of address. Instead, she took my hand and whispered, Sleep now. Mein Liebling, you are safe. When I recovered and recalled this incident, I felt something I had never experienced before. Genuine gratitude to a person who served me not from ambition or fear, but from simple human kindness. The final entries in Prince Edward's diary, written in late 1775 and early 1776, reveal a young man who has been fundamentally changed by his relationship with his governess. The initial resentment has been replaced by a complex mixture of respect, affection, and understanding. He has begun to grasp the magnitude of the gift she has given him, not merely an education in facts and figures, but a preparation for the moral and intellectual challenges of leadership. Mrs. Planta informed me today that my formal education under her guidance will conclude at the end of this year. He writes in November 1775, I am to be commissioned as a colonel in the Guards and will take up residence appropriate to my adult status. I should be rejoicing at my liberation from the schoolroom, yet I find myself strangely melancholy at the prospect of our separation. She has been the most constant presence in my life for these 3 years, more reliable than friends, more honest than courtiers, more dedicated than servants. She has seen me at my worst petulant, arrogant, sometimes cruel in the way that young people can be when they feel their dignity threatened, yet she has never abandoned her faith in my capacity for improvement. I asked her today what she hoped to accomplish through our years together. Her answer was characteristic in its directness. I hope to help you become a man worthy of the privileges you are born to, Your Royal Highness. Whether I have succeeded is not for me to judge, but for history to determine through your actions in the years to come. I pressed her for a more personal assessment. Did she think I had changed, had grown, had learned the lessons she tried to teach? She was quiet for a long moment, then said, When you first came to me, you saw your birth as a license for indulgence. Now, I believe, you begin to see it as a responsibility for service. That transformation, if genuine, is worth all the battles we have fought. The final entry, dated December 30th, 1775, serves as both conclusion and tribute. Tomorrow Mrs. Planta departs for her new position with Lord Pembroke's family. We exchanged formal farewells this morning. She curtsied, I bowed. We expressed mutual satisfaction with our association, but this evening she came to my apartments for a private goodbye. She presented me with a volume of Marcus Aurelius, inscribed in her careful hand, To His Royal Highness Prince Edward, who has learned that true nobility lies not in being born a prince, but in becoming worthy of the title. With respect, affection, and confidence in his future service to the crown and people of England. Planta, December 1775. I find that I cannot adequately express what her teaching has meant to me. When she arrived, I was a boy who believed that his birth entitled him to reverence and indulgence. She leaves behind a young man who understands that birth is merely the beginning of the story, not its conclusion. She taught me that a prince's greatest duty is not to be served, but to serve. Not to command respect, but to earn it. Not to demand love, but to prove worthy of it. I shall miss her more than I can say. She was never my friend. The difference in our stations made friendship impossible, but she was something perhaps more valuable. My teacher, my conscience, and my guide toward the man I hope to become. If I prove worthy of the crown I may one day wear, if I serve England with honor and wisdom, if I leave the world better than I found it, the credit will belong not to my royal blood, but to the Swiss governess who refused to let me settle for less than my best self. Prince Edward did indeed go on to serve with distinction, though not as king. His older brother George IV inherited the throne, while Edward became Duke of Kent and the father of the future Queen Victoria. His military career was marked by competence and humanity, his civilian life by charitable works and genuine concern for the welfare of his subjects. Those who knew him remarked on his unusual combination of dignity and accessibility, his ability to command respect without demanding deference. Mrs. Margaret Planta continued her work as an educator for another 30 years, serving in the households of the nobility and gentry, shaping the minds and characters of children who would go on to lead Britain through the tumultuous decades of the Industrial Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. She never married, dedicating herself entirely to her profession, and when she died in 1808, her funeral was attended by dozens of former pupils who had risen to positions of prominence in government, military, and society. The transformation documented in Prince Edward's diary represents something remarkable in the history of royal education, a genuine meeting of minds across the barriers of class and convention, a relationship that began in mutual antagonism but evolved into something approaching wisdom. Mrs. Planta succeeded not by demanding deference to her authority, but by appealing to the prince's better nature, challenging him to live up to ideals he had never been asked to consider. In teaching Prince Edward to hate her methods while respecting her purpose, she accomplished what perhaps no other royal educator had managed. She made learning feel like liberation rather than constraint, growth rather than submission. The prince, who began by calling her his jailer, came to understand that she was actually his guide toward freedom, the freedom that comes from understanding one's place in the world and choosing to fill it with honor. The diary itself, donated to the British Museum by Prince Edward's descendants, stands as a testament to the power of dedicated teaching and the possibility of genuine transformation. Its pages remind us that education at its best is not about the transmission of facts, but the cultivation of character, not about the imposition of authority, but the development of wisdom. Mrs. Planta's legacy lives on not merely in the historical record, but in the model she established for all who undertake the difficult work of educating those born to power. She demonstrated that it is possible to serve royalty while maintaining personal integrity, to show respect for rank while demanding excellence of character, and to love one's students enough to risk their temporary hatred in service of their long-term growth. In the end, perhaps the greatest tribute to her success is found in the prince's own words, that she helped him see his birth not as a license for indulgence, but as a responsibility for service. In making that transformation possible, she contributed to a tradition of royal education that emphasized duty over privilege, service over self-interest, and the cultivation of wisdom over the mere exercise of power. The mathematics of such teaching cannot be calculated in conventional terms. Mrs. Planta gave 3 years of her life to the education of one difficult, privileged, resistant young man. In return, she helped shape a leader whose influence would extend across decades and whose descendants would guide Britain through some of its most challenging periods. The investment she made in Prince Edward's character paid dividends that continue to compound through the generations. And perhaps that is the true measure of a great educator. Not the immediate gratitude of students, but the long-term impact on the world they go on to shape. Mrs. Planta understood that her real classroom was not the palace schoolroom, but the larger stage of history, and that her greatest lessons would be taught not through her words, but through the actions of those she had helped to form. Conclusion. The candle burns low as our journey through these forgotten chambers comes to an end. We have walked with women who gave their hearts to children they could never truly claim, who shaped the minds that would govern nations, who loved with a particular intensity that comes from knowing that every lesson might be the last, every moment of tenderness a treasure to be hoarded against the inevitable separation. From the gentle halls of Versailles, where Madame Brunette taught arithmetic to a doomed prince, to the secret nurseries, where Madame de Maintenon raised the bastard children of the Sun King, from the Prussian court, where Anna Katharina Muller died for loving too completely, to the British palace where Mrs. Planta transformed a resentful prince into a worthy man. These stories remind us that history is shaped not only by the crowned heads who commanded armies and signed treaties, but by the women who taught them their letters, wiped their tears, and helped them discover what it might mean to be truly royal. The mathematics of their sacrifice defies conventional calculation. They gave years of their lives, the full measure of their devotion, the best of their wisdom and care, often receiving in return nothing more than a modest pension, and in this knowledge that they had served something larger than themselves. Yet perhaps that was enough. Perhaps the true reward for such service lies not in recognition or gratitude, but in the quiet satisfaction of duty faithfully performed, love genuinely given, and young minds carefully tended during their most formative years. These governesses, tutors, and nursemaids inhabited a world very different from our own, yet their struggles remain familiar to anyone who has ever cared for children not their own, who has tried to balance love with discipline, who has sought to prepare young people for challenges they cannot yet imagine. They remind us that education is always an act of faith, that knowledge matters, that character can be shaped, that the future will be better than the past if we invest our best efforts in those who will inherit it. As you drift towards sleep tonight, carry with you the image of these dedicated women, working by candlelight in palace schoolrooms, their quiet voices teaching lessons that would echo through the centuries. Remember Madame Brunette's patient arithmetic, Madame de Maintenon's complex love, Anna Katharina's ultimate sacrifice, and Mrs. Planta's transformative dedication. They served in shadow, these women who raised kings and queens, but their influence extended far beyond the nurseries and schoolrooms where they labored. They helped shape the minds that would guide nations, the hearts that would make decisions affecting millions, the consciences that would wrestle with the eternal questions of justice, mercy, and duty. Rest now, knowing that somewhere in the turning of the world, their work continues. In every teacher who refuses to settle for less than a student's best, in every caregiver who loves children as their own, in every person who understands that true nobility lies not in birth, but in service in all of these. The legacy of the royal governesses lives on. Sleep peacefully and dream of a world where love transcends station, where wisdom is valued above wealth, and where the patient work of education continues, one child at a time, one lesson at a time, one gentle correction at a time, building toward a future worthy of the sacrifice these remarkable women made in shadowed rooms centuries ago. The story ends, but the lesson remains that the greatest gift we can give to any child, royal or common, is the knowledge that they are loved, that they are capable of growth, and that they have a part to play in the grand, ongoing story of human civilization. Good night.